Ivan didn't expect much from his latest experiment, and that was his first mistake. When you're a physicist working in a makeshift lab that smells like burnt toast and cheap coffee, it's easy to get into the habit of expecting failure. But there was something about the antimatter experiment that made him feel unusually optimistic, an optimism that would soon prove to be his downfall. It was late, past midnight, and Ivan was hunched over a cluttered workbench, muttering to himself. The dim light of his desk lamp flickered sporadically, casting strange shadows across the mess. Old textbooks, filled with scribbled notes and diagrams, lay stacked in precarious towers. Coffee cups, empty and half full, dotted the desk like little abandoned soldiers. If anyone had walked in, they would have thought he was on the brink of insanity. But Ivan, for all his absent-mindedness, had a certain brilliance that few could deny. On the whiteboard beside him, the word time was written in bold, frantic strokes. Underneath, an equation that didn't quite make sense lay half-formed. There were variables for space, velocity, antimatter energy, but the part that really troubled him was the section about time travel. Every time he looked at it, his mind raced to places it shouldn't go. Time travel was impossible, or so he thought. Well, what if, he muttered under his breath, tapping a pencil against the board. What if antimatter could be the missing link? What if antimatter could bend time itself? It was a ridiculous thought. But what was the harm in just trying it? He wasn't exactly on the cutting edge of conventional science, and the failure rate of his experiments was so high that a few more explosions wouldn't exactly ruin his reputation. With that, Ivan reached for the final piece, the antimatter vial, glowing faintly in the darkness. He'd spent years perfecting the creation of this tiny, delicate substance, almost like an artist sculpting a masterpiece, but with far more dangerous materials. It wasn't supposed to be used for time travel, but in his excitement, he didn't care. Maybe it was a little reckless. But what scientist hadn't been reckless at least once? The moment his gloved hand grasped the antimatter vial, something strange happened. A soft hum filled the room, rising in intensity, and for a split second, Ivan froze. The air around him seemed to ripple, distorting as though reality itself had just taken a deep breath. He glanced up at the glowing dial on his time machine, just a prototype, really, and his heart skipped a beat. The dial was spinning wildly, faster than he could process. The lights above flickered out, and a sudden jolt of energy surged through the lab, throwing him back into the nearest shelf. Books flew into the air, papers swirled like leaves in a hurricane, and the antimatter vial slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Ivan screamed, but the sound was swallowed by a loud, overwhelming sound of distortion. The very fabric of time and space seemed to bend and break around him. The floor gave way beneath him, and in an instant, everything went black. When Ivan opened his eyes, he was no longer in his lab. Instead, he found himself standing in the middle of what looked like his childhood home's living room, only it was eerily quiet. His heart raced in confusion as he glanced around. The decor was exactly as he remembered: old furniture, dusty curtains, a faint smell of mothballs. But this was impossible. He'd been working in his lab just moments ago. His first instinct was to panic. Was he dreaming? Had the experiment gone horribly wrong? But the air around him felt too solid for a dream. The room was too vivid, too real. Okay, this isn't happening, he muttered to himself, pacing back and forth. This is fine. This is just fine. Time travel. Antimatter. It's all fine. He took a deep breath and tried to focus. He quickly ran to the window and peered out at the familiar street, but nothing looked out of place. That was the problem, nothing was out of place. This was his home, but it couldn't be. He should still be in the lab, dealing with the mess of antimatter. This wasn't the future or some other point in time. It was his past. He looked down at his hands. The gloves were gone. His fingers were trembling as he realized the full weight of what had happened. The time machine, it worked, but not as he expected. He had been pulled back, thrown into his past, into a moment before he ever became the person he was now. Wait. No, 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 he said aloud, trying to think logically. I need to fix this. I have to get back. But something felt strange. The longer he stayed in this past, the more disoriented he became. It was like the world around him was slightly out of focus, as if reality itself was warping, blurring around the edges. His hands started to feel numb, his legs shaky. He reached for a chair to steady himself but had to stop. His vision was flickering. It was subtle at first, like a blink that lasted too long, but it was happening, then it hit him. He was losing something. Losing himself. What the hell? He whispered, his voice trembling as he stepped away from the window. What's happening to me? In a panic, Ivan ran through the house, trying to find something, anything, that could explain what was going on. But as he opened a door to the hallway, he realized it wasn't just his mind that was fading. His body, too, was changing. His limbs were becoming sluggish, his fingers felt cold, his heart pounding against his ribs. A sick realization struck him like a cold wave. Every time he changed something in the timeline, every time he adjusted the past, his body was paying the price. The more he thought about it, the worse it got. His legs grew heavier, his hands trembled as he clutched the walls for support. Memories, too, seemed to slip away from him like sand through his fingers. He could feel them slipping into the void, the people he once knew, the events that had shaped him, even his own name. No, he muttered, shaking his head. This can't be happening. Outside the window, the world continued as it always had, untouched by the chaos Ivan had just caused. But inside the house, time itself was fracturing, slipping through the cracks as Ivan's body paid the ultimate price for his meddling. The more he tried to reverse the changes, the more he lost of himself, and so, with every passing moment, Ivan was faced with a terrifying dilemma. Should he stop trying to fix the timeline, or continue meddling, even if it meant erasing everything, and everyone he knew, including himself? Ivan staggered down the hall, clutching the edge of a table for balance as his vision swam in and out of focus. His heartbeat was erratic, and each breath felt labored as if his lungs were losing the ability to take in air. Every corner he turned seemed to pull him further into a fog, his body beginning to fade like a Polaroid left out in the sun too long. The walls around him trembled slightly, as if reality itself had taken a step back to reconsider whether he truly belonged in this time that he had to get to the lab. That was his only thought, repeating like a mantra, even though the words felt foreign in his mind. Why was he so obsessed with the lab? Wasn't he here to fix something? No, he was here to fix everything. The disaster that started all of this. The moment when the antimatter reactor had destabilized. He had to stop it before it destroyed everything, before it destroyed him. Ivan stumbled into the kitchen, feeling his hands go numb as he reached for the counter. The floor beneath him felt like it was undulating, shifting with the pressure of his thoughts. He placed his hand flat against the cold marble, trying to steady himself, trying to fight the strange sensation of slipping further away. His reflection in the kitchen's window above the sink wasn't right. It flickered, as if the very fabric of his being was disintegrating in real time. His face, once sharp and clear, now seemed to distort, like a smudged painting. The edges of his body, his hands, his limbs, they all seemed translucent, as if he was a ghost, only half-formed. The reflection warped again, and in that fleeting second, Ivan couldn't remember if it was his reflection or someone else's staring back at him. "Get a grip, Ivan," he muttered, slapping his own face. His palm felt wrong against his skin, too light, too unfamiliar. It wasn't just his memory that was fading. It was his sense of self. It was like trying to hold onto a dream in the moments just before waking, the details slipping through his fingers, the connections dissolving. He glanced around the kitchen, seeing things he should have remembered. The worn cutting board on the counter. The old clock ticking on the wall. The half-open drawer with mismatched silverware inside. But none of it felt like his anymore. He didn't know what any of this meant. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor with a grunt, his hand sprawling out in an effort to catch himself. He was trembling. The sensation of losing himself was overwhelming, and it felt like something beyond just physical pain. It felt like a slow erasure, a slow disappearance from the world. A sudden jolt of panic shot through him. If he stayed here, if he stayed in this house, in this past, would he just vanish? Would he just fade out of existence entirely? But how could he fix it? The thought looped again. He had to stop the experiment. He had to prevent the chain reaction. But how? He couldn't even remember how to get back to the lab now. He couldn't even remember where the lab was anymore. Was it upstairs? Was it out in the garage? It didn't matter. He couldn't stay here, not in this place, not in this time. A faint sound, like a buzz of electricity, made him freeze. It was coming from the living room. He slowly pulled himself to his feet, gritting his teeth against the sensation of his body giving up on him, but still, he pushed forward. Something told him that if he could reach the source of that noise, he might find an answer. Or at least, a way out. The living room was dim, just the glow of streetlights filtering in through the blinds, casting long shadows across the furniture. The buzzing was louder now, almost deafening. But when Ivan stepped through the doorway, he froze. There it was, the antimatter time machine. Sitting in the middle of the room, exactly where it shouldn't be. He had never brought it into this house. It was back in the lab. But somehow, it was here, its sleek, alien form taking up space in his childhood home like an unwelcome guest, and that's when the real horror set in. The machine was active. Ivan's eyes widened. The machine, which should have been dormant in his lab, was glowing softly, thrumming with power. A low, pulsating hum reverberated through the room, and the air around it felt charged, like static electricity just before a storm. It shouldn't have been here. It shouldn't have been working. It shouldn't even exist yet. He took a step closer, drawn to it despite the nagging sense that he should run. He should be running away from this, running from the time paradox he'd created. But something inside him, something urgent, pulled him forward. The dial on the machine was spinning, faster now, with no rhyme or reason. He was sure it had never spun that quickly before, never had such an uncontrollable momentum. His fingers twitched as he reached for it, despite his fear. Something had to be wrong. Something had gone wrong again, and it was pulling him deeper into the spiral. Each turn of the dial felt like it was siphoning his energy away. And that's when he realized what was happening. It wasn't just the machine. It wasn't just the time travel. It was him. He was connected to this. His very presence here, in this moment, was feeding the machine, making it stronger, faster, more unstable. The more he interfered with time, the more his body, and his soul, was being consumed. He stepped back, suddenly feeling nauseous, his vision swimming. He could feel himself, his very being, slipping, the edges of him pulling away like fraying fabric. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not with the experiment so close to complete. Not when everything he'd ever worked for was on the line. Then the machine hummed louder, and the room seemed to ripple as time itself began to stretch. Ivan fell to his knees, hands clutching his head as a wave of dizziness crashed over him. The machine was pulling him in, dragging him into its currents, erasing his sense of self. His breath came in ragged gasps, and as he looked up, he saw it. The doorway. It was glowing, a crack in time, a shimmering portal right in front of him, waiting for him to step through. Waiting for him to make the final choice, and for the first time in his life, Ivan wasn't sure if he should walk toward it or away. His hand trembled as he reached for the glowing threshold, but something inside him screamed to stop, to pull back. To let go of this madness, to let time unfold as it was meant to. But before he could make his decision, the ground beneath him trembled again, the buzzing of the machine escalated into a roar, and the air around him cracked with the force of distorted reality. He looked up in horror as the very walls of the house started to dissolve. The furniture, everything he had once known, began to disappear, crumbling into nothingness as though the entire structure had never existed, and just like that, the world around him dissolved completely, the world around him shattered like glass, and for a moment, everything went black. Ivan didn't know where he was anymore. There was no house, no time machine, no glowing doorway. There was just emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. It felt like he was falling, but he couldn't tell in which direction. Up? Down? Forward? Back? It was as if he had been ripped from the very fabric of time and space. For a long while, he drifted in that nothingness. His body, what was left of it, felt like it didn't belong to him. He wasn't sure if he was conscious or not. His thoughts were disjointed, fragments floating through his mind, but they were hazy, fading even as he tried to focus on them. His name, his identity, everything that had made him, well, him, began to slip further out of his grasp, and yet, through all of this, one thought echoed louder than the rest: I have to stop it. Ivan didn't know exactly what he was supposed to stop, but that thought clawed at him. He couldn't remember why, couldn't remember how, but it was urgent. Desperate. The urge to fix things, to undo whatever he had done, pushed him forward, even if he wasn't sure which way he was going. Suddenly, there was a jolt, like the pull of gravity returning after a long absence, and the void gave way to light. The light wasn't bright, it was soft, like the twilight of a setting sun, glowing with a strange energy. Ivan squinted, disoriented, and felt himself drawn toward it, as though the light itself was a magnet, pulling him closer. He couldn't fight it. He didn't want to. He stumbled forward into the light, and as he did, the world reappeared, but it wasn't the world he had known. It wasn't the house, the lab, or even the time machine. It was something else. Ivan was standing in the middle of a wide, open field. The ground beneath him was soft, covered in wild grass that swayed gently in a breeze he couldn't feel. The sky above was vast, endless, stretching to the horizon in every direction. It looked like a landscape from a dream, too perfect, too serene to be real. He blinked, unsure of where he was or how he had gotten there. The light surrounding him faded, and the world settled into an unsettling stillness. There was no sound. No birds, no wind, no hum of machinery. Just silence. Where am I? He whispered to no one in particular. The question seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. Then, slowly, figures began to emerge from the horizon. At first, they were just shapes, shadows against the light. But as they drew nearer, Ivan saw them clearly. It was himself, but not exactly. They were versions of him, versions he didn't recognize. Some of them were younger, some older. Some were standing tall, others hunched over with weariness, each one wearing an expression of deep contemplation. They weren't speaking, but Ivan felt their presence like a weight pressing against him. They were him, but they weren't. One of the figures stepped forward, closer than the others. It was an older version of Ivan, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined with age. The older Ivan looked at him with sadness in his eyes, a deep, sorrowful understanding in those eyes that made Ivan's chest tighten. You've done it, haven't you? The older Ivan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years. You've gone too far. Ivan swallowed, his throat dry. What do you mean? The older version of himself shook his head, the expression on his face almost pitying. You tried to change things. You thought you could control time, control your own fate. But you can't. No one can. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Ivan staggered backward, his legs weak beneath him. But I didn't know. I didn't understand what would happen. I just wanted to fix it. I wanted to stop the accident. I didn't stop the accident, the older Ivan interrupted, stepping closer. You're too late. There's no stopping it now. It was never about the accident. It was about you, about what you gave up to try and fix it. Ivan's mind raced, and he tried to put the pieces together. But everything was slipping away, like water through his fingers. But I'm still here. I'm still. You're not. the older Ivan said softly. Not anymore. Not like you used to be. Suddenly, the landscape around him began to distort, warping and twisting as though reality itself was bending. The versions of Ivan who had gathered around him began to fade, their forms flickering, dissolving into the air like smoke. The ground beneath him seemed to ripple as if time was running backward. Ivan tried to move, tried to reach out to the older version of himself, but his body felt slow, unresponsive. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His body was giving out again, but this time it was worse. He felt like he was being erased from the very fabric of existence. No, he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. I won't let it happen. I won't let myself disappear. But the world continued to fall apart around him. The field, the figures, everything, was fading into nothingness. The light returned, brighter this time, engulfing him, pulling him in. Ivan wanted to fight it. He wanted to scream that he mattered, that he was someone. But it was useless. The pull of the light was too strong. It was a force far beyond anything he could understand. Time was closing in on him, and he couldn't stop it, and then, in an instant, everything went black. When Ivan opened his eyes again, he was back in the lab. The faint hum of machines buzzed around him, and the sterile scent of the lab's equipment filled the air. He could feel the cool metal of the workbench beneath his hands. He blinked, taking in his surroundings. The time machine was before him, just as he had left it. But this time, it wasn't glowing. It wasn't active. It was still. Quiet. The chaos he had just experienced, the strange field, the endless figures, felt like a distant memory. But it was real. It had to be real. He pushed himself to his feet, his body stiff and aching. It felt like he had just woken from a long, terrible dream. The machine in front of him was silent now. No more flickering lights. No more hum. It looked like a piece of unremarkable equipment, a relic from a failed experiment. Ivan stared at it for a long time, his breath shallow. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Time was moving forward. But for Ivan, it felt like time had fractured, like it had been ripped apart and sewn back together in a way that was no longer natural. He knew then, with a certainty that seemed to settle deep in his bones, that there was no undoing it. He couldn't fix the timeline. He couldn't undo the paradox. The more he tried to fight it, the more it consumed him. The very act of trying to change things, to control time, had been his undoing, and now, he was left with the consequences. Ivan looked at the machine one last time. It was silent, dormant, a reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had given up in his desperate attempts to control fate. He didn't know what would happen now. He didn't know if he would fade into nothing, or if he would remain trapped in this fractured version of reality. But there was one thing he knew for sure: time was no longer something he could control. It was something he would have to live with, and in the end, that was the most cruel thing of all.